Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Griffin. I'm the Executive Director at the Foreign Policy Initiative. On my own behalf and on behalf of my Board of Directors, it's a great pleasure to welcome you this morning to our forum. As a quick moment, of course, I want to thank our presenting sponsor this year, Raytheon, for their generous support for this year's forum. And before introducing our first panel, want to note that the framing issue for our discussion this year is a world in crisis, the need for American leadership. And we could have no better introductory panel to address that topic than Senator Bob Corker, moderated by Fred Hyatt, addressing the question of what the United States should do in response to Iran's nuclear ambitions. Fred will be moderating the discussion. I believe he's very well known in this room. But he served since 2000 as the editorial page editor at the Washington Post, a paper that he joined in 1981. Every other Monday, he publishes a column in the Washington Post, which I believe everyone here reads religiously. It's a great column. And has also served as a bureau chief in both Tokyo and in Moscow. And it's a great pleasure to welcome him and to welcome Senator Corker for discussion this morning. Thank you both.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you all. Thank you, Senator Corker.
Yes, sir.
I think you all know Senator Corker was elected to the Senate in 1996.
2006.
2006, re-elected 2012, after serving as mayor of Chattanooga, active on the Banking Committee, but also, for purposes of today, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Sources say he may be tapped for a higher job there in the coming session. Our schedule says we're supposed to talk about Iran, and I'd like to begin with that, but the senator has agreed that we can range a little further afield, so we will solve all the problems of the world. But let me start with Iran. You said better to postpone than to come back with a bad agreement.
Right.
They've now postponed. What would a good agreement look like? And is it still possible, do you think, based on what you know the administration and its allies have already agreed to?
Yeah. So I think, and this is, I think, felt in a bipartisan way. I noticed Senator Menendez has been pretty vocal over the last 24 hours, but I think we began in a place with the initial agreement that put us on line not to do the kind of deal that most Americans thought would be an appropriate deal with Iran. And so we're starting in a place where we're already behind the curve. And so, you know, how do you figure out a way to make it better? And I think one of the things, to put it in context, is, I mean, basically, if you think about where our negotiators are, they're hoping to stave off for a period of time until there's a different regime mentality in Iran, their production of a nuclear weapon. What Iran is doing is hoping to alleviate sanctions until such a time they're in a better place to be in a position to very quickly move to a nuclear weapon. So, you know, this is an interesting dynamic, and when you think about the length of term of the agreement, it becomes pretty frightening. We all began talking about a 20-year term, with us having incredible insights into what Iran is doing. Now the administration is talking about a double-digit length, which, based on the way they approach most things, means 10 years. And Iran is talking about 5. You get concerned that likely they will, you know, split the baby and end up with a 7 or 8 year deal. So very quickly you realize that over a 7-year period, 8-year period, based on the way they're going today, you end up in a situation where Iran is in a situation where they're treated like any other NPT country. They've had all of their sanctions removed, and they're in a much, much different place, and all along the way have been developing the ability to deliver. I mean, one of the things that's not covered under this agreement in any way is their ability to continue to develop delivery systems and warheads. So it's pretty problematic when you think about it in that context. And so what can Congress do? Obviously, the easiest thing to do, simplest thing to do was, it's not probably going to happen, but we could just do away with all the national security waivers that are in the existing legislation so that they would have to come back to Congress. I think some Article 2 people and others would maybe criticize that approach. The other thing we can do is what the Corker-Graham bill now states, and that is to ensure that they have to come back to us for an approval, which I think gives the administration the ability to negotiate a much stronger arrangement. I mean, if you look at everything that's happening within Iran, the Ayatollah is the one that's the backstop to keeping something more moderate from occurring. I think Congress is actually, and being bellicose, has actually played a productive role in this thus far. I think the negotiators would agree with that. So, length of term, to answer your question, I think, something far more robust than where they are today. And secondly, certainly getting into the past military dimensions of what they've done, I think to go beyond that is a total loser for us. I think we have to get them to come clean with what their past military dimensions were. I think that gives us some insights into the IRG and other operations that otherwise we would not get. But I'm very concerned about where we are. I think we're headed to a place where we're going to lose leverage and not get much. We used to talk about dismantlement. Now we're talking about basically unplugging, dealing with plumbing in a different way. So I think you're going to see a more robust, you're going to see Congress and the Senate playing a much more robust role here during the first quarter.
Some people in Congress seem to want to go further than your bill, and that is impose more sanctions now, on the argument that this would help the negotiators. Susan Rice said that would blow up the talks. I think that's what she was referring to when she said that. What's your view?
Well, I co-sponsored the bill that does that, and we actually had some language in there that laid out what a good deal would look like. So, by the way, these sanctions are not sanctions that would go in place today. If I remember the bill correctly, what would happen is they would put sanctions in place should a deal not be reached. But it also would snap back the sanctions that have been alleviated should a deal not be reached. It's very difficult to understand how that is problematic, meaning that you're not really adding any sanctions at present. You're just saying if we don't reach a deal, it's going to get much tougher on the country itself. So I think, look, there's not a lot of credibility that exists relative to the threats that, this is going to blow things apart. On the other hand, I will say, Fred, look, in the minority, and although this is a bipartisan issue, in the minority, you can write letters and say a lot of things that you know are never going to make it into legislation. We're going to be in the majority. We are in the majority come January, and certainly the things that we do need to be thoughtful. They need to move us to a place that makes our nation much stronger, and I think there needs to be a lot more discussions about why imposing additional sanctions, if we don't end up with a deal, would cause the situation to dissipate. It's hard to understand why that would be a problem.
You referred to the things that Iran is doing. Part of what's underlying some of this is there are people who argue that Iran is naturally a U.S., if not an ally, a partner, that we don't really have competing interests. Obviously, both countries look at ISIS as a threat now. And the administration at times has seemed to look at these talks as opening the way to much broader cooperation. Obviously, other people have a view that that's naive. And how do you see if there were an agreement, would it open up the possibility of a better relationship?
Well, we don't know, do we? And again, it looks like an agreement, if one is reached, is going to be of a very short-term nature. I do think that Secretary of State Kerry, one of his traits is to see the world as he wishes it to be. I think that's an acknowledged worldview. You know, it's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, it worked with us, some, I guess, in South Africa to deal with them in a way that, you know, they came forward and began to deal with the world community in a different way relative to their nuclear weapons. But there's no indication that that's the case with Iran. Certainly pre-79, they were an ally. Things have changed. I think that prudence would go on the side of not being naive about what could happen, but actually wanting to see some changes of behavior as things are taking place. I mean, not just should these negotiations over time include just the nuclear component, but just their role in the region right now. I mean, they do have U.S. blood on their hands. I don't think there's any question about that. They still are contrary to us in many places. And let's face it, the fact that these negotiations are taking place and haven't come to consummation at present is really keeping, in some ways, the administration from doing the things that may be done in Syria. There's no question that there's a tie there. So,
Explain that. What should we be doing that we're not because of Iran?
well, I think that I think there's you know, there's certainly sort of private side talk that you know, there's the agreement is certainly at least one component of a more robust policy in Syria because of the ties that exist between the regime and Assad itself. So, I mean, there's no question that there's a tie there that is an inhibitor. Now, I do think at the end of the day, the president is not at a place where he really wants to. I mean, this is a personal thing. I don't think this is the people around him, but I believe that he is at a place where he's not ready to have a more robust policy in Syria and still has concerns. And look, I'll be the first to admit that we have a very complex situation there. But I'd also say that the negotiations with Iran certainly are another impediment to that because I think there are discussions about cooperation, as you just mentioned. That cooperation certainly means that at present the administration doesn't want to overly agitate the regime in Iran right now.
The arguments I hear, aside from whatever personal feelings and convictions he may have, against more robust action against Assad, right now there seem to be two. One is Iran would take it to the United States in Iraq and make life difficult there. The other is you would just open the way for Sunni extremists, ISIS or others, to take over in Syria. How do you respond to those two concerns if you're advocating a more active anti-Assad campaign?
Yeah. So I think you know, the anti-Assad campaign doesn't mean anti-Alawite, and I think that, you know, if you listen closely to you know, the conversations that are taking place, there's a desire for Assad to leave, but then there's a desire to figure out some way of having a government. By the way, this is all easy to talk about, much harder to do, as we've seen over and over again, but to create some type of partnership government between the bureaucrats that do exist within Syria and do have the ability to cause the government to function so that we don't do the same kind of thing we did in 2003 in Iraq, but also bring the Sunni population into the fold. I mean, again, that's so much easier said than done, but when we say Assad, we're talking about him as an individual over time, but keeping many of the Alawite intellect, if you will, in place. Back to Iraq, I mean, at the end of the day, it's obviously not in Iran's interest they have actually aligned interests with us in many ways. It's not in their interest that these Sunni extremists continue to gain territory. So look, we have allowed a situation that was already complex to become even more complex by not having a policy in Syria for as long as we've had it. It's made it much more difficult, and at present, that's the reason we've continued to talk to, just yesterday, talked to the administration about the AUMF issue, and that is that they're not ready to come to Congress for an AUMF because they are not yet in a position to articulate a strategy in Syria that passes the common sense test. I do think that General Allen.
So the president said he wanted Congress to pass an AUMF, but you're
Well,
saying they haven't.
Yeah. Typically, look, I mean, I think everyone here is obviously steeped in the traditions of how we deal with foreign policy. Typically, when an administration seeks an authorization, they explicitly seek it by sending up a draft of what it is that they are seeking. This thing, and I became particularly upset with Kerry the last time he was before us, when he said that, look, we don't really need an authorization, but if you guys want to be constructive and write one, then that's fine. Well, that's a silly game. And what is left out of that is the administration coming up and explaining very clearly and selling to Congress what it is that they're attempting to do and telling you how they're going to go about doing that. And that's why, to me, it's very important, as I stressed again yesterday, for them to come explicitly ask. But the piece that's so important is they've got to lay out the outcome that they are seeking. They cannot really do that today. They cannot lay out how they're going to go about making that happen. As I just mentioned, it's easy to say what I just said, but it's much more difficult. And by the way, it is difficult. I acknowledge that. So what I hope is going to occur is that during this first quarter, they are going to come forth explicitly, but secondarily, they're going to, and importantly, they're going to be able to talk with us about how they're going to go about achieving that. They have no idea yet. I think General Allen is making some good strides. I think this focus on this northwest triangle where around the Aleppo area, you don't create a no-fly zone. That's a word that people don't want to use. I forgot the word we're using now, but it's in essence a no-fly zone. And in essence, you allow refugees to be there, but also some training of the moderate rebels, but also you begin to deal with Assad in such a way, because Turkey becomes more involved. He realizes that over time he's being pinched in such a way that maybe there's a reason for him to negotiate a settlement where he's out of there. I do think, again, Allen is making some good strides. I think giving them some time, although, again, these nuclear negotiations create some complications, giving them some time, I think they may come forth with something that Congress can buy into. Now, for the good of our country, one of the things that we need to absolutely ensure doesn't happen is that they come seek an authorization and we're not able to pass it. I mean, that is a loser for our country. It's a loser for our Middle East policy. And that's why in advance we need to be working together to begin talking about what that should look like before it's actually explicitly laid out.
I want to do two more questions on Iran before we leave it entirely. If you look forward 6 months and they again don't manage to come up with an agreement, which seems quite plausible given how far apart they are, the president has always said no options are off the table.
Yeah.
But there's been a lot of speculation about whether he means it, and there have been a lot of people who say military option is a loser because at most you set them back 2 years, and so even if it's morally justified, it's strategically a mistake. You're going to be in a position where your views on that could be very important, and I wonder how you think about how we should think about that.
Well, I don't think that, first of all, you go back in time when we did what we did in Iraq, I think it's acknowledged it had a pretty big impact on Iran. I mean, they had illicit, I believe, I think most people believe, they had an illicit program that was underway that had military dimensions to it, and it stopped for a period of time. So the threat of force the concern about maybe the same thing happening in their particular situation certainly had an impact. I don't think they have any degree of thought that today, while these negotiations are underway, that there's a potential for a military situation. I mean, I think they believe that this president, I think our intelligence officials would say that they're not discussing in Iran the threat of kinetic activity. If it falls apart, would they over time, with a presidential election coming up and another potential president coming in, would that be of potential concern to them? I think it would. Is it a loser? It is. And that's why I think people have been, like Senator Menendez yesterday, although he's been there the whole way, I think that's why people have been so concerned about the path that we're on, because we have had extreme leverage. The international community has been together in a very unique way, and it appears we're about to let that leverage dissipate over a very, very short-term deal that will very much change the dynamic of what we have to work with them. And this is where the administration, I know they get caught up in their own rhetoric all the time, but people have concerns about the deal are warmongers. Well, no, it's just the opposite. People that are concerned about the deal are concerned that we're giving up the leverage that in a bipartisan way we've all worked hard to create, and we're going to end up in a situation where over time, when we're in a very different situation, they have much more capabilities relative to breakout capacity.
And if they came back with an agreement, a short-term agreement that you thought was weak, I'm wondering, no matter what you do in the Senate, won't every other country say, look, this was good enough for President Obama?
Yeah.
We're not going to. So is there any possibility of keeping sanctions up at that point?
So it's a great point. I was talking to a Democratic senator yesterday that's not on the Foreign Relations Committee, and obviously, foreign policy is something that you want to develop bipartisan consensus on, always, if you can. And I was talking to him about this bill. Well, wouldn't it be good if the president had to come back to Congress for approval? And his response to me was, well, what worries me is what senator would really vote to approve a deal with Iran? I said, well, look, the fact is that I think when you get to that situation, Fred, exactly what you just said is true. I mean, what a senator is going to have to weigh is, look, the international community is going to fall apart. I mean, in essence, what Iran is urging the president to do right now is to go ahead and temporarily suspend. They're not concerned about whether Congress approves this or not, because they know that when he temporarily suspends, the deal's over. You understand? I mean, the international coalition is broken apart at that moment, and that's why they have said directly to the administration, it doesn't matter to them whether it's permanently done. The temporary suspension meets their needs because they understand exactly what you're saying. So, again, I think as much as all of us have concerns about where we are, I do think a Congress faced with the situation of approving or not approving would certainly take into consideration the reaction of the international community and our ability to work together towards an end relative to Iran. And that will be a factor that certainly would be on, I think, any thoughtful person's mind. And I think most people, when it comes to issues like this, the thoughtful component hopefully comes out.
I'd like to let time for at least one or two questions. So let me ask you one more on Russia, and then we'll open it up. The question of arming Ukraine, sending lethal, also of NATO stationing troops in the Baltics. As some people say, why would you provoke? Other people say, let's deter. How do you look at that kind of a question? And how do you think a Republican Senate will look at that kind of a question?
Well, let me go back and just briefly state that I think the worst moment in U.S. foreign policy since I've been here, as far as signaling to the world where we were as a nation, was August a year ago when we had a 10-hour operation that was getting ready to take place in Syria, and it didn't happen. And not only did it not happen, we didn't communicate with those folks who were going to be a part of it with us until they watched the president on CNN. That was devastating to us, I think. In essence, we, sorry to be slightly rhetorical, jumped in Putin's lap, and you know, we are where we are today in Syria. We lost a lot of momentum, I think, with the Syrian rebels at that moment, the moderate opposition. So let me go to Russia. I think that was a learning experience for Putin. I really do. I think it's had some effect on his calculations in Ukraine. And again, I thought that when he had 40,000 troops on the border before anything had actually happened in eastern Ukraine, that was the time for us to hit them with significant sectoral sanctions. We didn't. We tweaked some folks around him, which, by the way, their wealth has been created because of their relationship with him. I don't think complaints to him do a lot of good. And so, you know, we let the genie get out of the bottle. He's now riding this nationalistic wave that everybody in this room knows about. It's very difficult to dismount off of that, especially when you have the economic issues inside the country that you have. You have to have something holding things together. And so, look, the arming, I've been very disappointed in the administration, which held off for some time, and still I don't think is fully clean here. We had intelligence inside Ukraine, not on the Russian border, inside Russia. Inside Ukraine, we knew exactly what Russia was doing, where they were doing it, and we would not share that. We would not share that with Ukraine, a country that we urged to move west. Remember, we urged them to do what they did, okay? And we wouldn't share that because, quote, it would make us appear to be operational. Look, the lethal support to me is something that certainly is not going to mean that they would ever be able to stand up to Russia. It's not going to happen. It raises the price. It shows a little bit of a deeper commitment. The language, I think, is nuanced in such a way that you're talking about lethal support. It authorizes, by the way, the president to do this. Lethal support that they are capable of utilizing. In other words, we don't want, obviously, we want them to demonstrate the capacity to be able to intelligently use what we would give them. But look, this passed unanimously out of the Foreign Relations Committee. I wrote a bill in advance with 23 other senators, I don't know, 6 months ago. Now we have bipartisan agreement. It passed unanimously out of committee. We hope to run a hotline on it in the next short period of time. And, you know, there are some various senators who have some issues, but it's my hope that we're going to be able to get it potentially, and I know this is based on the way things are somewhat difficult, but potentially get it out of both bodies before we go home. We have a lot of work to do to make that happen, but I think it's a strong piece of legislation that pushes the administration forward slightly more robustly. But again, we waited too long. The genie's out of the bottle. It's very difficult to see how we don't end up in a frozen conflict there. But we are where we are. Yeah.
Is there somebody who wants to? Sure. Yeah, well, hold on. I think there's a microphone coming. And would you identify yourself again, please?
TASS News Agency, Russia, Anatoly Bachinin. My question is about the bill you talked just seconds ago. How do you expect, will White House sign it?
Will the White House
Sign it.
You know, it's authorizing legislation, meaning it authorizes, it doesn't demand. I think, again, it passed unanimously out of committee. If it passes this time, it means it has to pass through unanimous consent, meaning every senator has agreed to it. I think they'd have some difficulty vetoing something like that should it occur. I don't think they would.
What do you think the impact of the oil prices will be on Putin?
Well, look, you know, it's actually much better than any of the sanctions we put in place, right? And, you know, one of the things that, you know, I had a group in yesterday. One of the great privileges that people like you and certainly the people in Tennessee give me is to be able to sit down with intelligent people, like people in this room, but others from all around the country and world on a daily basis. And one of the things that was discussed yesterday was, look, does it make any sense for us to begin looking at opening up exports on our petroleum, but also condensates, to take advantage of, but basically going back to the Iran issue, does it maybe help some with that, with some of the countries that over time will be demanding a relationship with Iran to supply their own petroleum needs? Does that help us strategically? But certainly back to this, Russia certainly is reeling. I think you saw yesterday where they have, you know, officially proclaimed that they're going to be in recession this next year. And again, I get back to the nationalistic fervor that's taking place. You know, probably causes Putin in some ways to even ride that horse harder, because that's all he's really got to ride with right now. So we need to certainly pay attention. And, you know, really weak nations and weak states sometimes certainly don't do rational things relative to outward issues, and we certainly need to pay close attention.
Let
Just
me
one more question, please. Okay.
No, I'm sorry, because we're really out of time. But if I could just close with a slightly more philosophical constitutional question. You wrote an excellent op-ed in the Washington Post not too long ago, and you said Obama is an unreliable ally, and it's hard to watch. Now you and a Republican Senate are going to be in a position to do a little bit more than watch. When you think of the next 2 years, how much influence do you think the Senate can have on foreign policy? How do you think about the role you can play in a divided government?
Yeah. Well, again, I hope, look, I am very disappointed in the administration. I don't think there's a Republican senator that spent more effort on a myriad of issues working with them to come to conclusion. And I'm disappointed not just in their approach, but I'm also disappointed when you have something working, their inability to even coordinate making it happen. I'm disappointed. We have 2 years more. At the same time, foreign policy, in spite of that disappointment, is something that we should, as a nation, do everything we can to deal with in a bipartisan way. Bob Menendez has been a very good partner in that regard. So what are the things we can do? Certainly, one of the things we could do is actually pass a State Department authorization, by the way, which hasn't been done in years. I can't even remember the last time. It hasn't happened since I've been here, and that helps lay out little things, but it certainly causes the State Department to pay far more attention to the Foreign Relations Committee, just that effort of laying out what you're authorizing them to do or not do. Let's face it, most people on my side of the aisle are strong Article II folks, right? I mean, the President is Commander-in-Chief, and we need to understand what our role is. But things like this Ukraine legislation, we will address, I think, in some form or fashion in a meaningful way. Congress playing an appropriate role in this Iran issue. But look, there's a healthy respect for the role that the President plays in foreign policy. I do believe that we can shape things, and much of what we do is really helping shape the American people's perspective on what we should be doing. The Foreign Policy Committee, Foreign Relations Committee, if you think about what the administration does on a daily basis, all administrations, they deal with things coming in over the transom every day, right? Crises. I mean, that's kind of what administrations do. One of the things the Foreign Relations Committee can do is to set a context for our nation to understand what is in our nation's national interest. And when these occurrences come up, allow us to think about how we go about dealing with them in a much more thoughtful, longer-term fashion. That's a role that I hope we will ascend to. I know it's been that in many years past. It's sort of lost that luster in recent times, but I think we can have, as long as we handle ourselves in a thoughtful way, as long as people understand this is not about some partisan dig, but really about our nation's national interest, I think we can have far more impact than we've had, and that's what I hope to achieve should I be given the opportunity you talked about earlier. Thank you.
Unless FPI wants to give us another half hour, I'm afraid we have to stop, so.
Okay, it doesn't
Thank you
look
very
like they want
much.
to. Thank you.